So tonight is the third in this series of Shirim. As I say every time, it's hard to know exactly what to say amongst the vast wealth that there is to say about Pesach. And I've tried to take a different sort of angle each time. The first week we talked about the structure of the Haggadah and the structure of the Seder. Last week was practical halachot. Next week will be a more philosophical analysis of the message of the Seder and how it relates to past, present and future, and how it contains great relevance for us. So tonight is about what I've called the aims of the Seder and some ideas about how to achieve them. And as I say, there's so much to say. I'm just going to scratch the surface and share a few ideas based on what we do at our Seder, and I hope it will be of some interest. Let me start with a general point that really applies to everything that I'm going to say tonight. And that is this. When it comes to the food, we probably spend a lot of time preparing the food. We buy the food, we kasher the kitchen, we cook the food. I say we in the most liberal sense. And we spend hours, days preparing for the food of the Seder. In order to have the most fulfilling and worthwhile and meaningful Seder, we need to spend a lot of time preparing the other part of the Seder. In fact, the significant majority in terms of time of the Seder. We need to prepare the Haggadah. There is a custom on Shabbat Hagadol at Mincha at the end of Mincha before Aleinu, to recite part of the Haggadah. Not the whole bit, but the essence of it, from Avadim Hayinu to the end of Dayenu, which covers all the main bits. And one of the reasons we do that is very simply to prepare ourselves for the Seder. So when it comes to the Seder and we open the book, it shouldn't be fresh, it shouldn't be brand new, and we shouldn't think, oh, what are we going to say about it this year? And inevitably, if we end up in that situation, we'll probably say the same as we said last year and the same as we said the year before. It is absolutely essential that just as we work hard to prepare the food, we should work hard to prepare the Haggadah. And to me, that means reading one or two or three of the vast number of beautiful Haggadot that are available today in English and in Hebrew. Every year there's at least another half dozen new ones, each with a slightly different angle, each with a different philosophical take, each with a different style. And the time in the week before Pesach, so between now and the Seder, is the time to get out those Haggadot. My wife's not here tonight, so I'll say to go out and buy an extra Haggadah or two. She probably wouldn't approve because I seem to do that every year. And to look for interesting insights and analysis that helps one prepare either if one's going to be a guest at a Seder or if one's going to be leading a Seder. And everything I have to say tonight is really predicated on that degree of preparation. And if one doesn't prepare, it's much harder to have a meaningful Seder for oneself or one's guests. And if one does prepare, by reading, by learning, by understanding new insights and new things to share, then it's most likely that the Seder will be more meaningful for oneself and for others. So what is the objectives? What are the objectives of the Seder? Well, in one sense, one can say, as one says regarding all aspects of our life, to fulfill mitzvot. So let me just briefly recap. Last week I said there are 7 mitzvot we have to fulfill at the Seder. There are 2 midoraita from the Torah itself, one of which is to eat matzah, and the other is Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, to recount the Exodus. There are 3 which we get from the rabbis. One is to drink 4 cups of wine, one is to eat maror, one is to say Hallel, and there are 2 which we have to do, as it were, anyway, because they occur. One is to make Kiddush, and one is to say Birchat HaMazon. Those are the 7 mitzvot, and we have to do them. And we talked last week about how we do them. So one criteria for a successful Seder is that we did everything right. We ate when we're supposed to eat, and we leaned when we're supposed to lean, etc. And that also takes preparation. That also takes care in making sure that we fulfill all the mitzvot with their details. But let's talk particularly about one of those mitzvot, Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, telling the story of the Exodus, roughly equivalent to reciting the Haggadah, but much broader than that as well. What is the purpose? What are we trying to achieve when we tell the story of the Exodus? Well, of course, that question is a little bit flawed to start with, because what we're trying to achieve is to fulfill the mitzvah, which is to tell the story of the Exodus. But what marks success in doing so? Well, one is to convey the information. The mitzvah is v'higadata levincha. You shall tell your child. Parents have a mitzvah to convey information to their children. Obviously, this makes more sense when the children are young, but it still applies when the children are not so young as well. So one success criteria is, have we conveyed information to our children? 2, as we say in the Haggadah, chayav adam lirot et atzmo. We have to make the story relevant to ourselves. On one level, we have to see ourselves as if we went out of Mitzrayim. So one level is to imagine that we were there, and to use various different techniques, educational techniques, different media to actually convey that impression. It's part of the act of telling the story. But another aspect of that is to understand how it relates to us and relates to us today. How, in a sense, we came out of Egypt, even though that happened long ago, but nevertheless, we as a national entity, the same national entity of which we are part of today, we also came out of Egypt. I don't want to spend too much on that now, because that's going to be more of my theme next week. And then we have to create a connection between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a risky business to say this is the purpose of a mitzvah. However, it's not too hard to say that one of the purposes of telling the story of the Exodus is to create that sense of connection between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I want to dwell on this theme a little bit. And let me ask a few questions. Number one, if you like, another aim, but I'll mention it now in this context, is to experience chirut, to experience freedom. And some of the things that we do at the Seder, we lean, we dip, we dress in fine clothes, we decorate the table beautifully, more so than any other night of the year, is to experience chirut, to experience freedom. Now, we can ask, what does it mean to experience freedom, particularly in our day? Baruch Hashem, we are free. We live a life of freedom. We do not know what it's like to be a slave. Baruch Hashem, in this country, in this time, we do not know what it's like to have our religious practices constrained in any way. And, let's be honest, we have reached a certain socio-economic madrega, whereby dressing finely and decorating the table is also not such a big deal. It's not so different from what we do every week, and in some respects, what we do every day. So, we have to understand what is chirut. Another question I would ask is a profound theological question. And that's this. We thank Hashem for taking us out of slavery. But if we believe Hashem runs the world, then in a very real sense, He put us into slavery in the beginning. So what do we achieve? What does He achieve by making us slaves and making us unslaves? I should at this point apologize to those who are at my shir on Shabbat afternoon. I'm repeating myself what I said in the last section of that shir, because it's worth repeating. Another question. We open, as is very well known, the Seder with Manishtana, with a child asking 4 questions. The question is often asked, do we answer those questions? The answer is we absolutely do. And the question is sometimes asked because we look for the answer in the wrong place. The 4 questions are, why are we eating matzah? Why are we eating maror? Why are we dipping? And why are we leaning? And if you look in the very next paragraph, Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim, and in some Haggadah it says, here is the answer. And you read the answer and you say, well, it doesn't mention matzah, it doesn't mention maror, it doesn't mention dipping, it doesn't mention leaning. What sort of answer is that? Well, the reason it's not an answer is because that's not the answer. As I said in the name of the Malbim 2 weeks ago, who expounded the whole Haggadah by reference to the pasuk, "V'higadta levincha bayom hahu." What we're doing when we say Avadim Hayinu is explaining why we have a mitzvah to tell the story. It's just the opening introduction. Now, before I tell you where the answer is, a little historical note. but the 4 questions we have today is not the 4 questions that appeared in the Mishnah, because there used to be a question about matzah, there used to be a question about mara, there used to be a question about dipping, and the 4th question was, on all other nights we can have our meat, however cooked in any way we like. Tonight we only have roast meat. That was a reference to the Korban Pesach. It's very interesting. If you look at the Mishnah in Pesachim, where the 4 questions come from, A, they're in a slightly different order, and B, they have that different version, because that Mishnah was composed in the time of the Bet Mikdash itself. So basically, the child is asking 3 plus 1 questions. 1 question is about matzah, 1 question is about maror, 1 question is about the Korban Pesach, that's the one we don't have today, and 1 question is about dipping, which is a sign of freedom. And when you see that sort of paradigm, it's obvious where those questions are answered. They're answered when Rabban Gamliel says you've got to talk about 3 things: Pesach, Matzah, and Marah, which correspond perfectly to 3 out of the 4 questions. And the 4th one about dipping, that's answered in a more general fashion, that we are displaying signs of freedom. We used to be slaves and now we're free. So, well, are those 4 questions answered? Well, at least 3 of them are absolutely answered. But then the question, and Rav Hirsch asked this question, is why does it take so long to answer the question? The kid asked the questions, and 2.5, 3 hours later, however long your Seder takes, and I'm going to talk about how long Seder takes, you get to the answer. Why does it take so long to answer the question? And one more point. So, I think we said 2 weeks ago, or I'll say now, the Mishnah says, the same Mishnah in Pesachim says, Matchil b'ganot u'masayim b'shevach. The way we tell the story is we begin with disgrace and we end with praise. And then the Gemara brings a dispute between Rav and Shmuel as to what that means. Shmuel says, we begin with Avadim hayinu lefara b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves. Meaning, the story we're telling is that of the physical slavery, and that corresponds to the physical redemption. We were slaves, and then Hashem took us out. And we say that line of Avadim Hayinu straight after Manishtana. As I've said, it's not the answer to Manishtana, but it is the beginning of telling the story. Rav, another Amora, has a different view. He says, when it says we begin with disgrace, we say, Mitchila ovtei avodah zara hayu avotenu. Our ancestors used to be idolaters. The story we're telling is that of a spiritual redemption. From the time that we were idolaters, that's our murky origins, in the time of Terach, the father of Abraham, even Abraham himself in his very early days. And the corollary is that now Hashem has brought us near to him. And we tell that story as well. Mitchila of Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu is another paragraph that comes a little bit later in the Haggadah. Now, really, of course, these 2 stories are not separate. They are at least overlapping. In fact, they are 2 facets of the same story, because the physical and the spiritual redemption came together. And with that in mind, if you look at the 2 lines which are critical, and you look at the beginning of the story and the true end of the story, in other words, the beginning of Avadim Hayinu and the end of the bit about the spiritual redemption, you get Avadim Hayinu l'Paro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Paro in Egypt, and then after we used to be idolaters, v'achshav karaveno hamokom la'avodato. And Hashem has now brought us near to his service. And there's an obvious play on words here. We used to be avadim, and now we've been brought near to Hashem's avodah. The same word. It's not surprising, but the question ascribed to the wicked son is, Maha avodah hazot lachem. What is this avodah to you? And someone will explain, but the question is, I don't get it. We're supposed to celebrate freedom from slavery, and now we're having to do some avodah. It's the same word. And in that question is the whole story of what we're celebrating. We did not become free in the usual sense of the word. We did not become free to do nothing. We did not become free to live our lives exactly as we want. That's not what Chayrut is. That's Chovshi. As in Liot Am Chovshi, but that's another story. Chayrut, as the Gemara says, Al Tikra Chayrut Ela Charut, don't read Chayrut, freedom, but read Charut, engraved, as in the words of Torah, engraved on the Luchot. Our freedom is not just freedom from, it's freedom for. There are 4 expressions of redemption. And the first two is, I will take you out from the burdens of Mitzrayim, and I will take you out from the work. And then I will redeem you. And the fourth is, V'lakachti li la'am. I will take you to me to be my people. And then it goes on to say, and I will be your God. For us, freedom is from being the slaves to Paro in order to be slaves to Hashem. You can call it slaves, you can call it servants, if that's slightly more comfortable. The two words are synonymous in Hebrew. But that's what we're celebrating. We're celebrating the fact that we are no longer slaves to Paro, but we are slaves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I would suggest, and this is just my idea, so you can take it for what it's worth, I would suggest that answers the question of why Hashem made us slaves in the first place. Because only by being slaves to Paro do we understand what it is to be a slave to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I would also suggest, excuse me getting just a little bit political, that we are facing challenges, we as Orthodox Jews, from outside Orthodoxy and even from within inside Orthodoxy, by people who say, why don't we change the rules to make it more comfortable, to make it more nice, to make us feel better? And I think those questions come from a place of not understanding what it means to be an Eved Hashem. An Eved serves their master, not in the way that makes the servant feel good, not in the way the servant wants to live, but the way the master dictates. That's what it means to be an Eved to Hashem. And I would suggest that when we're talking about the connection we have with Hashem, the relationship that we have with Hashem as a result of Him taking us out from Egypt, the relationship that we're trying to consolidate and inculcate in ourselves and in our children, and the Seder night is the occasion par excellence when we teach this lesson, we have to understand what it means to be an Eved Hashem. Rav Hirsch says, the answer to the questions asked by the child come at the end of the Haggadah. Because the child is asking, why do we have this particular mitzvah? Why do we have a mitzvah eating matzah? And Rabbi Gamliel says, well, matzah is there because it reminds us of the speed with which we came out of Egypt. But says Rav Hirsch, there's a fundamental step which is missing. So, okay, I understand there's a mitzvah, but why do I have to do it? That why do I have to do it is the middle 2 hours. It's what the Haggadah is all about. We were slaves. Hashem brought us out. He made us His slaves. Therefore, part of our life, our task as a Jew, is to do what He says. And then I'll tell you 3 things that He said. He said we should eat Pesach. We said we should eat matzah. He said we should eat maror. Only after the whole story of the Exodus does the concept of the mitzvah of Pesach, matzah, maror, and by extension every other mitzvah, now make sense. So it's not that we're waiting till Rabbi Gamliel for the answer. Everything up to there is part of the answer and the essential preamble to the answer. We're telling the children and we're telling ourselves, why do we eat matzah? Because we have a mitzvah to eat matzah. Why do we have a mitzvah to eat matzah? Why should we have to keep this mitzvah? Because Hashem said so. Why do we have to do what Hashem said so? Because on this night, He made us His people. And He made us He became our God, and we became His servants. That's what Cherut is. That's our concept of freedom. It's not about the fancy clothes and the nice cutlery. Those are just manifestations of what it means to be a free person who is in total control of their moral lives and is able to dedicate themselves to the service of God. I would say that's the message of the Haggadah. Now, at this point, if I'm talking about practical ways to share messages with everyone at the Seder, the question might be, well, what happens if I've got someone at the Seder who's not interested in being a servant of God? What happens if I've got someone at the Seder who doesn't even believe in God? What happens if I've got people at the Seder, some are young, some are old, some are incredibly frum and yeshivish, and some are almost on the way out. In other words, I've got 4 children as the Haggadah lists, and probably quite a few more. I must be honest. It's a problem. It obviously is a problem. The Haggadah talks about God on every single page. the Haggadah talks about what God did, the miracles, and our relationship with God, and the mitzvot we have to do. So, I must be honest when I say that any other message that we give, because it's more palatable to some of our audience, is really a pale imitation of the real thing. But let me suggest two other messages, which I think come out of the words of the Haggadah, and are certainly worth sharing. And one, which I'm going to talk more about next week, is the sense of the national entity, the collective entity which is called the Jewish people. Now, part of the story, an essential part of the story, is the relationship between that entity and God. But let's say we want to focus on other aspects. In addition to that, we should acknowledge that tonight is the genesis of the Jewish people. A people that was a bunch of slaves became their own autonomous, sovereign nation. The Jewish people was born. We can connect to the Jewish people throughout history. And it's no coincidence that when we tell the story of the birth of the Jewish people, we do it in a way that connects generations round our own table and connects us to the significant majority of the Jewish people around the world who are also sitting round tables having some sort of Pesach Seder. It is, by the way, I'm not sure if it's more popular than Hanukkah or less popular than Hanukkah, but it's right up there with a Jewish observance which is participated in by a vast majority of Jews. So we can talk at the Seder, and we can talk to those particularly for whom the servants of God message might be a little bit too hard to digest along with the matzah, about the fact that we are celebrating the existence of the Jewish people. We have various Independence Days, if you like. We have Yom Ha'atzmaut, but we'll talk about that another time. But the 15th of Nisan, the night of Pesach, is truly an Independence Day for the Jewish people itself. And then we can talk about how we choose to celebrate that Independence Day. And I've mentioned two particular features. One, not just the fact that we have food, because that's a very Jewish thing to do, but one, that we sit round a table, as I said already, with generations. We sit in families, because the family is the essential building block of the Jewish nation. And families were so critical to the story of the Exodus. But the Pesach, the sacrifice, was taken and eaten in a family. Sometimes 2 or 3 families together. It actually takes quite a lot of people to eat one lamb. And the other thing is, and I'll come back to this soon, is that the way we tell the story is through learning. It's interesting that the Haggadah is not a history book. It's often observed that if we wanted to tell the story, we could either get out a book of biblical archaeology, better still perhaps, a better book, we could read the first 12 chapters of Shemot, and we could read about the Exodus. We don't do that. The Haggadah actually is short on historical detail. What the Haggadah gives us is learning. The Mishnah says, Aaron said, you start with praise and you end with, you start with disgrace and you end with praise. V'doresh mi arami avodavi ad sheyigmar kol haparsha. You, doresh means expound. I'll give a different meaning later, but you expound the parsha of the 4 Pesukim, which I'll come to in a moment because we have to understand what they are. And we add the rabbinic midrash in order to expound and to understand what they're saying, and in order to search for other texts and compare one text to another. That's what midrash does. And that's one section of the Haggadah. It's a pretty key section of the Haggadah. But around that are all the other paragraphs of the Haggadah. And our task is not just to recite them. Our task is to understand them. Our task is to learn them. When a Jew wants to connect to their history, just as when a Jew wants to connect to their God, our way is to learn. It is not just to eat, not just to do, certainly not just to recite, but to understand and to learn. And I would suggest that the idea of the national entity and our history and our longevity, our eternal existence, is another message that we can give to those at our Seder based on the words of the Haggadah. And the fact that we celebrate our Independence Day through learning is also another message. So in practice, how do we keep everyone amused at the Seder? Especially those who might not be so interested. Well, let me tell you what I don't think one should do. I feel there is a tendency, and some Haggadot actually encourage this, deliberately or by accident, to take the view that the Haggadah is basically boring, and our task is to talk about anything but the Haggadah. So we talk about the weather, we talk about politics, we talk about Israel, we talk about all sorts of social issues. There are some Haggadah which basically use the text of the Haggadah purely as backdrop, as purely as to find some sort of spur which will encourage us to talk about some sort of other issue. Question is, should we give games to the children? And I'll talk about that in a moment. And sometimes the attitude is, in order to keep the children amused, we must keep them away from the Haggadah because it's too boring. In order to keep the children involved in the Seder, we must rush through the Seder till we get to the dinner as soon as possible, because otherwise they'll be bored. That is a terrible educational message. If the way we keep people involved is deliberately or in a roundabout fashion avoid talking about the text of the Haggadah, we are telling them that they are right, that it's too boring. And that is a terrible thing to say. So when we find things to keep our audience interested, I would urge us all to find them in the text of the Haggadah, which goes back to what I said at the beginning. That can only be achieved if we prepare well in advance. I talked about finding things to say. The first thing to say is to explain what's going on in the Haggadah. And the reason I dedicated the first year to the structure of the Haggadah is because, in my opinion, that's the key to everything. Without understanding the structure of the Haggadah, it's all a big jumble. We have this rabbi and 5 rabbis here and finger of God there and those pasukim which we really don't understand in the middle of it, and then let's get to the dinner. If we don't understand what's going on, then of course nobody's going to learn. So the first thing I would say is to understand how the Haggadah fits together. What's the point of this paragraph, and why does this paragraph come before this paragraph? How are we telling the story in different ways? What are people supposed to take away from each section? I think that's a very important thing to share with the people at the Seder. And then to find interesting insights to share on different levels. Let's start with children, little children. Now, of course, little children find it hard to relate to everything that's going on at the Seder. The irony is they are the most important people there. Because, as I said, the Haggadah Levincha means we have a mitzvah to tell our children about the Exodus. The Rambam says beautifully what you say to a little child. You say, we used to be slaves, like this maidservant and that manservant. The Rambam obviously assumes we all have servants in our house, so it's good to get a few servants in for the Seder night, just for this, so you can demonstrate that. But if we live here, we've moved from other countries, now we have to manage without servants. So we tell children on the simplest level the basis of the story. And that's a mitzvah. And even if they know some of it already, we tell them a little bit more. The mitzvah is to increase our children's understanding of the story of the Exodus. Now, should we give our children games to play with and toys and so on? In my opinion, yes. And the practice at the Kennard family Seder when our children were young, in fact, carries on when our children are old, is to festoon the table with things representing the 10 plagues. We had lots of frogs, and we had some babies who'd not made it through Makkah's Bechoros, which looked a bit sad. And we had finger puppets. And we went to town on the little toys. Other people, perhaps I think, are much more imaginative, and they create games, and they create puzzles and quizzes. And I think these are all wonderful. As long as they serve as a means to convey the story of the Exodus, and not as a distraction from it. And also, it's obviously quite important, if you're going to use lots of little plastic frogs around the table, the child knows that this isn't the real thing. But the child knows that this is just a representation of the frogs that there were in Mitzrayim. it's possible for a child to think that the real thing is the plastic frogs. And it's important that they know what's the real and what's the image. So, yes, I would encourage people to find clever devices for young children to relate to in their way, which might include toys and games and puzzles and puppets. But as long as they are related to the message of the Haggadah and not a distraction from it. It's not so hard to find toys and games, etc., which do relate to the story, and then to bring them in to the conversation. It's also important to understand, to make sure that the children hear the main parts of the Haggadah. Obviously, I'm talking about slightly older children. Some people have the habit of, they make the child stand on a chair and say Manishtana, and everyone cries or claps or whatever, and when that's done, they send the child to bed. As if to say that what they've just done is purely a performance that nobody understands, just like the child doesn't understand, and once you've done your performance, off you go. Of course, the Manishtana is the set of questions which should provoke the answer, the further discussion from the parents to the children. And certainly, and I know it's the end of the Seder, but the child should still be there for Rabban Gamliel. Now, obviously, if it's a very, very little child, it's not going to understand anyway. On the cusp of some sort of infant understanding, yes, of course they can go to bed. But an older child, they should be there for the main part of the answer to their question. Which brings me on to say, I'm not a fan of very, very long Sedarim. I'm not saying this is in any way a halachic point. I'm not even saying I'm right. I'm just sharing you my thoughts. That especially when the person leading the Seder has to do this job of being a sort of conductor to keep everyone happy, one has to sort of control the ebb and flow. And in my opinion, especially when there are people at the Seder who might be less interested to start with and whom one has to work to involve, that a long, long Seder is probably not the best way to do that. And a Seder doesn't have to be very, very long. I don't want to give a particular time frame, but there's no mitzvah to drag it out ad nauseam. There's no mitzvah to go on and on at the Seder. There is a mitzvah to carry on all night talking about the Exodus until you fall asleep, but that can be afterwards. As we know, the afikoman has to be eaten by chatzot. Some say Hallel has to be recited by chatzot. The paradigm is not a long, long, long schlepped out Seder. I used to, when I was a kid, I remember that you would meet in shul the following morning and there would be a competition to know how long your Seder had lasted. Ours went till 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock? Ours went till 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock? We were just serving the soup at 3 o'clock. That's not good. It's really not good. Especially when we're there to tell a story and to convey information and to convey a message. And while I'm on the subject of timing of the Seder, I often wondered why other people's Sedarim took so very, very long and so much longer than ours. And part of the answer is because the meal is schlepped out in some homes. In our house, meal is a fairly rapid affair. Actually, we don't have a vast number of courses because we're already quite full, and that's not the most important aspect of the evening. The meal shouldn't really be schlepped out so long. As a rough rule of thumb, it certainly shouldn't take anywhere near as long as the Haggadah, because the Haggadah is more important. The meal is part of the Seder. It's one of the simanim of the Seder. It's Shulchan Aruch, but it shouldn't take up such a significant portion of the time as it does in some places. I said last week, and I'll repeat again because it's relevant now, it's very important that everyone at the Seder understands the Haggadah. And for that reason, many parts of the Haggadah should be said in English, if that is the language that most people at the Seder understand. And if it's said in Hebrew, and there are people there who don't understand the Hebrew, then you haven't done the job. Let me just remind you that there are certain parts that must be in Hebrew. The brachot, Kiddush, the bracha of Asher Ga'alanu, at the end of, just before the second cup, at the end of Magid, all of Hallel, 2 paragraphs before the meal and several paragraphs after the meal, benching, Alamichya or Alagefen after the 4th cup. I think that's just about it. Everything else can be in English, or at least it can be in Hebrew and English if you want to keep everyone happy. But if it's in Hebrew and there are people who don't understand Hebrew, then that's not the way to do it. And another thing I said last week, and I want to reiterate again tonight, is that some people have the style that everyone says the Haggadah to themselves and simultaneously. Some people have the style that we rely on the rule of Shemea Ka'oneh, that you can listen to somebody else saying the Haggadah, and if you listen carefully, it's as if you've said it. So that means the person leading the Seder could be the one saying it. Or it means you can share bits out. And you can share bits out, and different people can say the different parts of the Haggadah, and everyone else can listen. Or people who want to can mutter it quietly to themselves while somebody else is reading out. In our family, that's the way we've always done it. And again, in terms of making people at the Seder feel involved and feel connected, it's something I would recommend strongly. Just be careful whom you allocate the wicked son to, because some people get a bit touchy. And there are ways, maybe allocate the wicked son and the Chacham, the wise son, together in one go to make it clear one's not casting any aspersions. I'd like to conclude with the particular style about the way we tell the story. It's something that's obvious, you know it, and yet it needs to be stressed, I think, more because it's really the way the story is told. As I said last week, we have a mitzvah of Sifri Yetziat Mitzrayim. We have a mitzvah of mentioning Yetziat Mitzrayim every single night. We say the Shema, the third paragraph of the Shema talks about the Exodus from Egypt. The question is asked, what is the difference between these two mitzvot? To put another way, you've davened Ma'ariv, you actually mention Yetziat Mitzrayim again in Kiddush. Why do we have to mention it again and again throughout the Seder? And there are many differences, there are many answers to this question. One is that when we tell the story, we have to see ourselves as if we went out of Egypt. We have to make it relevant, we have to personalize it, we have to feel for ourselves that we are actually going through this transformation from slavery to freedom. That doesn't apply when we just mention it in the Shema. But another answer is that when we tell the story at the Seder, there's a particular educational motif, a particular pedagogical method that we employ. And this is called question and answer. Any teacher and any parent and any person, so I think I've covered everyone, will know that when a person is curious about something, they're going to be more receptive to the information that we give as a result of responding to that curiosity, responding to that inquiry. That is why we have this quite odd idea that some of the things that we do at the Seder, when we wonder why do we do them, the answer is only to make people ask the question, why do we do them? It's a remarkably circular process. And how does it make sense? We lift the Seder plate. In the old days, they used to remove the whole table when people had their own individual tables, and the Mishnah talks about moving the whole table. I talked last week about the point of karpas, and I said that the reason we have karpas is because of a suffix with a bracha, a doubt about whether we're going to make a bracha later on, and using the karpas is a way of getting us out of that situation. But the other reason given about why we have karpas is to make the children ask a question. We have a vegetable at a rather odd time in the meal, we dip it, which we don't normally do, and we want the children to ask questions. Why do we work so hard to make the children ask questions? Because that's the process that we're engaged in. It's not just a teacher standing up and telling a story, and the child, if they're awake, takes notes. If they don't, they don't. We have to make the process interactive. And the way we make the process interactive is by encouraging the child to ask questions. Questions are the key to a successful Seder. Now, by the way, another little hobby horse of mine, I mentioned it before. These days, from some schools anyway, the children come home with an exercise book full, not of questions, but of answers. The child stands up, they perform the mitzvah, you shall tell your father, and they read out page after page of question and answer, question and answer, question and answer, and it's beautiful, and you think the school's really good because the exercise book is very thick, but they're not actually experiencing what the Seder is all about. The Seder is all about them wanting to know more. Now, we start with 4 questions. Those are the questions prescribed in the Haggadah, according to one way of reading the original Mishnaic source, and that the Gemara even talks about this, is those are just questions for those who haven't got any other questions. The Gemara gives a story of a child who asked a question, why are you lifting up the table? And the rabbi said, you have exempted yourself from having to say Manishtana because you've asked a question already. We don't do that, and especially if the kids spent the last month learning Manishtana, we don't want to stop them doing that. But in essence, the Manishtana is an excuse for a question, and if it's not that question, it could be another question. Our task at the Seder is to encourage our children to ask questions. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we tell them, please ask questions. Secondly, we reward them. I know of one Seder where every time the child asks a question, they get a present. It used to be a sweet or a lolly. Now, of course, it's like something more nutritious. But they get some sort of acknowledgement in a way that speaks to them. Another way to ask questions is to encourage everybody else at the Seder to ask questions. And to make it clear, no question is out of bounds. Any question is relevant and is encouraged on this night of questions and answers. The only proviso I would say, like I said before, is the question should be somehow connected to what we're talking about, which is the Exodus from Egypt and our relationship to God and our national history, not a question about some peripheral, tangential matter. And the other way to encourage questions is for ourselves to ask questions to the ones around us. Now, questions can be in two forms. They can be questions like quiz questions, where we know the answer. But here's the big secret. There's nothing wrong with asking questions to which we don't know the answer. A long time ago, when I taught at a school in a faraway country, I did the thing of giving the exercise book full of Divrei Torah to the kids so they could go home and the school would look good. But I also gave a page of questions without answers to be discussed at the Seder. I have to say, I got a number of complaints. I got a number of parents, not everyone, but some parents basically screamed at me, "What are we going to do with this? We don't know the answers. What are we going to do?" And I tried to explain that was the whole point. There were some questions to which I knew the answer, and there were some which I didn't, but I thought they were interesting questions to explore together. I said earlier that the Mishnah says, "V'doresh kol haparsha." And I said Doresh means expound. And that's the source for the idea of when we actually tell the nuts and bolts of the story. When we go through those 4 Pesukim and we add the midrashic exegesis to use the words of Chazal to reach some sort of understanding of what we're saying, which of course leads on to many more questions. Doresh can also mean to seek, to try to find out, to seek and not necessarily find. Doresh kol haparsha means we seek the answers. And that is the essence of the unique way in which we tell the story. There's something very profound. There's something very Jewish in telling a story in the form of questions, of finding more things to discuss, more angles to explore, of asking questions to which we do not necessarily know the answer. And by the end of the evening, we might still not know the answer. But that's the way that we're told to do it, because that is the way that is the most effective way to engage the curiosity of our children, of those around us, and of ourselves, and to make children and those around us and ourselves receptive to what may or even may not be the answer. If we keep ourselves focused on the text of the Haggadah, and believe me, there's plenty of scope to ask questions, to explore, to discuss, to learn in the text of the Haggadah, without needing to jump to politics or other social issues or whatever. If we keep ourselves focused on this primary Jewish text, if we bear in mind the objectives that we're trying to achieve, to know what happened, to share that information with our children, and to encourage a greater sense of connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a sense which is predicated on us being slaves, servants of Hashem, just as we used to be servants to Paro. And if we do that by asking and asking and asking questions, whether we know the answer or whether we don't know the answer, then in Yetzer Hashem we will be successful in telling that story and ensuring that our children tell that story and our grandchildren tell that story, and the story will continue to be told until eternity. Thank you very much.